all of my PowerPoints, I had my good friend Mark Smith review them. So anything I say that's not right, it's his fault. Mark is, he sometimes teaches for SBSs and different YWAM stuff too. He's from, just retired from the College of Idaho in Boise. And really, really good scholar, archaeologist, and a classical scholar. If you're interested, he and I have written a book that will be out sometime before the end of this year. It's right now in the typesetters, called The Last Days of Jesus. And so his archaeological expertise, I'm a biblical scholar, and we go into the last 5 days of Jesus in, I think, some, I would say this, of course, groundbreaking detail. At some point later this year, if you want to find, it's published by Whiff and Stock, which is a major publisher on the West Coast. I'm not sure when its release date will be, but I know we're in the typesetting is done, and we're kind of proofing the typesetting, and we're getting close anyway. All right, these are the churches that Paul left behind, as well as a few other people as well. But by the time you get to the roughly middle or late middle of the first century, you have a burgeoning group of congregations that are scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world. Whoops, I went the wrong direction with that. We go back the other way. So we have the church and the churches. Now in the New Testament, you probably already know that the word ecclesia is the Greek word for church or congregation or assembly. You can translate it different kinds of ways. But you do need to understand there are two ways that the New Testament uses this term. One is of local congregations, and most of the references in the New Testament are to local congregations. But there are a number of places where it is used in a larger framework to refer to all of the Christians in the Roman world, which is very close to what we would mean when we talk about the church. By the church, we're not talking about the one over on 2nd and 4th Avenues. We're talking about the church in the world. I'm an Anglican, by the way, so every Sunday when we do the liturgy, one of the standard prayers that we pray is for the whole state of Christ's church. We're not talking about the Baptist church or the Presbyterian church or your local church. We're talking about the church, the whole state of Christ's church. And you start that idea in the New Testament, but it's going to become a larger idea as you move toward the 2nd century. And that's where we start running into the word. Now fasten your seatbelts. I don't want you to jump out of the plane here at this point. But we start finding the word Catholic. Now the word Catholic is not a bad word, even if you are an anti-Catholic, and God forgive you if you are. You're supposed to love everybody, okay? But the word Catholic begins as a very early word to talk about the whole church. And it appears in Greek, it appears in Latin very early. So in Greek it is Katholikos. In Latin it is Catholicus. But it basically means the whole church. Okay, not the Roman Catholic Church per se, but the whole church. And we find that beginning very early. It occurs in the first time in 110 AD in the writings of Ignatius. Now that's really early. That's within 10 or 15 years of the last book of the New Testament. So we're talking very early when that language begins to be used. So that is a language that continues on through the early churches, not as a way to talk about some particular church, but a way of talking about the church that is in the world, the whole church. So now we're going to be moving toward the 2nd century, late 1st and early 2nd century, what is often called the Ante-Nicene Church. Be sure you don't say anti-Nicene, it's ante-Nicene. This is not something against anything. It is the word ante, which means before. So this would be the church before the Nicene Council, okay? Not the church that is against the Nicene Council, all right? I know none of you would make that mistake, but have run into people who have, so I thought I would mention it. All right. The churches the apostles left behind. James, the brother of Jesus, is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Paul, of course, has a number of churches in Asia Minor and Greece. Barnabas has gone to Cyprus. Paul and Peter and others are in Rome at some point. Titus is in Crete. Timothy and John in Ephesus. And maybe Matthew in Antioch. That's a little more sketchy. And so I think that one I put a question mark because that's a scholarly guess. There are some good reasons for it, but it isn't as tight as the other references. And of course in Rome there is this famous marble inscription, Paul, Apostle, Martyr, which is in Latin. Any of you been to Rome, by the way? I don't know if you've been to St. Paul outside the Walls Church and seen this inscription. Back in, I need to get rid of that bar at the bottom. How do I do that? Somebody told me how to do that once, and I can't remember how he did it. Because it's covering up some of my letters. Do you think you know how to do that, Izzy?
I don't. Does somebody know how to do it?
Because it's not on my screen, it's just on that.
Oh, yeah.
Mark does. Mark is really good at this.
He knows? All right. Okay. So can I exit?
Yeah, I can exit out of that, yeah.
All right. Yeah, I think you've got reverse screens here, but come on, right click.
Dan, can you take a question while they work?
Yeah, I can, and if they've got the mic.
Oh, I have it right
You already have it. I'm sorry.
Question. So in that list, I didn't see Alexandria. Was it also, because I know Apollos apparently went to Alexandria.
Well,
Was there a church there? After?
Apollos doesn't seem to come from a church there.
Okay.
When he first encounters Prisca and Aquila, he's not really yet a Christian. And they kind of bring him in. Whether he started a church when he went back or not, we don't know.
But there was a church there.
There was a church there, yes, but we know that from after the first century,
Oh, okay.
not during the first century.
Okay.
So the long-standing tradition is that Mark went there. That's the reason half of the Orthodox churches are called St. Mark's Church, because Mark was supposed to have gone there. But that's later than the first century.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, we did it. Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I need to ask you how you did it so I can do it again if I need to sometime. I won't do that in class. One of the interesting things is, I don't know if I have that on yours or not, but back in 2009, St. Benedict, the Pope, gave permission to do carbon-14 testing on the bones in this grave in their first century. Now, that's not to say necessarily that that's St. Paul, because there's no way that carbon-14 can put a name on anything, but it can put a pretty tight date. And those bones are first century bones. So I know that's kind of interesting. Maybe they are Paul, who knows. This is the church at Antioch, which is, by the way, there are two Antiochs. You're aware of that? Two Antiochs in the ancient world. One in Syria and one up in Asia Minor. This is the one in Syria. But there's a huge cave back in here, was the meeting place of the Antioch church. And these sort of windows that are carved out of the rock lets light into this area church. So this is Peter is believed to have preached in this church. That's the long-standing tradition. It's not something in the New Testament, but it is a very long-standing tradition. And Antioch becomes one of the most important churches in the early church. Yeah. Yeah, let's get a mic here. Yeah, great, thanks.
We were doing an outreach in Turkey,
Mm-hmm.
and went to Antioch and saw this land and
Sure.
this cave.
Yep.
And what we heard was that land was owned by Luke, and Luke turned it over to the church.
To the church.
Yeah.
That is the tradition, yeah. A number of those traditions are very old, and when I say we, I'm talking about the scholarly community sometimes debate on how much weight we give to ancient traditions. But they are very old traditions, and they're a lot closer to it than we certainly are. So I probably am inclined to give a fair amount of weight to those traditions, and you'll find other scholars that they don't want to do that. So you get some, get some back and forth on that kind of thing. Yeah. So now we go to some questions that have to be answered, because in the earliest church, no one knew for sure how long the church was going to last. You remember from the end of John's gospel, there were some people actually thought John would live to see Jesus return. And John makes the comment, he says, now Jesus didn't say that. That's just sort of their conclusion, but that's what they thought. And there's some other aspects of that as well. In Paul's early letters, when he talks about the second coming of Christ, he uses the first person plural pronoun we. We will not all sleep, we will all be changed. In his later works, he uses the third person plural pronoun they. Is that significant? Well, I don't know, but it sounds like it might be that Paul at some point decided maybe I'm not going to live to see this happen. In any case, the church is going to have to come to terms with this, that Christ does not return in their lifetimes. There's a term for that scholars use. It's called the delay of the parousia, which means it's taken longer than they thought. So you might run into that phrase from time to time. In any case, this is the kind of questions that they're going to have to answer. What's the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? What forms of worship can be used for Christian congregations? What are the scriptures that we consider to be authoritative, that is sort of our canon, if you will? They're not using the word canon quite this early, but anyway. How should leadership and succession work? Jesus appointed the 12 apostles, but he gave no instructions for their successors. So how are we going to do that? How should we treat opposing religious ideas? They've already answered that question to some degree by bringing in the Samaritans. So they're at least, something other than just outright antagonism. What church administration is necessary? We run into some titles in the New Testament like presbyteros, which is the word for elder. We run into the word diakonos, which is the word for deacon. We run into the word episkopos, which is the word for overseer. So we have some hints in the New Testament that they have leadership positions, but there's nothing in the New Testament about a senior pastor or a lead pastor or a music pastor or any of the other things you might find in the 21st century. Those are not part of the New Testament. So they've got a lot of stuff they've got to sort of work through as they move forward. What's the relationship between Christianity and Rome? Well, it might depend on whether you're reading 1 Peter or the book of Revelation. 1 Peter, you're supposed to behave yourself and obey the authorities. The book of Revelation, the government is from the devil. So it's, you have even some different points of view in the New Testament about that kind of question. So conspicuous by its absence is any attempt by the early church to extend the roles of the apostles into the post-apostolic church. That is one thing that did not happen. And it always makes me uncomfortable when I'm with a group of Christians who have decided to call their pastor apostle something. The early church didn't do that. The 12 are a distinct group, and by definition, they had to have been with Jesus from the baptism of John until the ascension. Well, that's a pretty small set of candidates. You can't do that in the 20th or the 21st century. So they have to think about that, though. However, they do have a group that we today call the Apostolic Fathers, which are the earliest leaders in the church that knew the apostles personally And that's a part of church history. It's very early, and that probably most modern Christians don't really think much about. There is a group that knew the apostles personally and wrote about them and what they learned from them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I did have this one interesting thing from the catacombs in Rome. The earliest depiction of Jesus in Christian art was always the Good Shepherd. There are several of them in the catacombs. There's actually a three-dimensional one in the catacombs and some other places. But this is the earliest depiction of Jesus in Christian art, is Jesus as the Good Shepherd with a lamb on his shoulders, which I think says a lot about their mindset, about the way they thought about Jesus. Yeah. Yeah, Peter, it's coming up.
I just want to ask about Paul. Does the early church acknowledge him as an apostle, or do they look up in him more as like an apostolic father? Because you see in the text that
Sure.
they try to replace Judas.
Yeah,
But that person.
but that's not Paul.
No, but
Yeah.
that person is insignificant
Yeah.
in the sense that doesn't show
Yeah.
up, and then Paul seems to be
Yeah.
God's choice.
They do recognize Paul as an apostle in the second century church. Not as one of the 12,
Okay.
but as an apostle nonetheless. And largely on the basis of Paul's own language, he says, I'm an apostle that was born out of time. I'm sort of out of sequence. And Paul never numbers himself with the other apostles. He always talks about the 12 apostles as a group outside himself. He's not part of that. But he is an apostle in some sense that is higher than a deacon, for instance, or something like that. And the second century church does recognize that. Yeah. So let's talk about the separation from Judaism. Jesus was, of course, Jewish. The apostles were all Jewish. This is the remains of a Jewish synagogue. The archaeologists have excavated in Gamla, which is in Galilee, but you can kind of see the sort of the footprint of a synagogue from the first century. The temple and synagogue continued to be revered by the earliest Christians. The earliest Christians meet in the temple. They meet in Solomon's colonnade. Paul invariably always starts with the synagogue. The only place he didn't start with synagogue is Philippi because there wasn't any synagogue. So he starts with the Jewish prayer group down by the river. Apparently there weren't 10 males in Philippi, Jewish males. You have to have 10 Jewish males to start a synagogue. So it's very patriarchal. I know it's not protocol for YWAM, but anyway, that's what it was then. So Paul joins this women's prayer group down by the river, and that's his sort of input into Philippi. As Christian Jews begin to spread out from Jerusalem, they originally, as I mentioned earlier, only shared the message of Jesus with other Jews. It's very tight, but eventually, of course, it spreads beyond that. James, in the letter of James, addresses the Christians and says, for if a person enters into your synagogue, and you say, well, sit down here by my feet and